Okay, thank you for the invitation to the organizers. For once, it is nice to not be the kind of exotic token presentation from the East in a Western context, but to be presenting within this context of with focus on Central and Eastern Europe. So I don't have to explain as many concepts. I will take you to the late 1970s in the GDR now, where a spectre is haunting the Republic. The spectre of postmodernism. It is startling the well-established modern or functionalist perception of architecture, messing with the regularity of the building system, and, just as Mickey Mouse in this caricature of the Nikolai quarter with its reconstructed buildings and its arcades made from prefabricated concrete, and I've seen the booklet with Postmodern knows no joke. So this spectre is associated with capitalism. But what exactly did GDR architects and theorists think this spectre was? And why was it perceived as such a threatening spectre in the first place? My presentation will trace the debate on postmodern architecture in the GDR and contrast it with a few buildings and projects of that time. As a main source, I'm using the protocols, the written protocols of the so-called seminars on architectural theory. Those were seminars from 1968 on that as an annual event were organized by the Union of Architects and by Bauakademie, the scientific institution for architecture and urban planning in the GDR. Which means that the participants were both architects and researchers. On the basis of the presented papers and the following discussions, which are also protocoled, it is possible to retrace events, political shifts, and ongoing debates. And I've just listed the topics of those seminars in the 1980s, and you can see that there were some topics quite virulent in especially the first half of the 80s. I will only give a short outline in this following 20 minutes on the debate and complement it with other sources as well. Just a sentence about that. These findings are a part of my work-in-progress dissertation with the working title Theories, Post-Modernism, Architecture and Urban Design in the Last Decade of the GDR, which the title addresses the often raised accusation that East German architecture would be lacking the irony that should be a given in postmodern architecture. It is always hard to trace the origins of the development. In the GDR, the first projects that could be attributed with a postmodern approach or a postmodern attitude date in the middle or even early 1970s and were urban regeneration or better reconstruction projects for an inner city development with a kind of adapted panel building system that traced the historic urban layout and implemented some stylistic features of the respective region. The discussion, though, on postmodern architecture had its first peak in 1982. It was triggered by two major projects in Berlin, the Nikolai Viertel or Nikolai Quarter, an area in the nucleus of the city that was destroyed during World War II. It was set to be reconstructed in a mix of a few existing buildings, some buildings that should be reconstructed loosely based on the historic designs and complemented with newly erected buildings. And I have some pictures from the construction period here and some newer ones. And those new buildings had prefabricated facades from concrete panels with arcades, balconies, pediments, and other decoration. The second project, Friedrichstadt Palace, on the other hand, was a variety theater. Again, photos from the construction site. And it again had a prefabricated facade and lots of ornamented decoration. This is what it looks like today. Both projects were discussed quite critically and inspired a very thorough exploration of international developments in architecture. And those developments, and in particular postmodern architecture, were the subject of the 1982 seminar. Christian Schädlich, an architectural historian and professor from the architecture school in Weimar, was giving a very concise overview on the development of postmodern architecture in the West. He was showing pictures of almost all the landmarks of postmodern architecture, cited Lynch, Venturi, Blake, and was actually quite enthusiastic about what he presented. At the end of his presentation, however, he was referring to the question if postmodernism would be a solution to the problems GDR architecture had to face then. He resumed, "The formalistic positions that are directed against the scientific technical progress, as well as the eclectic and social passive creative method, are unsuitable for the solution of our own architectural problems." And furthermore, he said, "I think it is obvious that this postmodernism is connected to the signs of crisis in the late bourgeois society. What becomes obvious here is A, that the conception of architecture was still strongly connected to the belief in progress, as it was typical for the post-war modernism of the 1960s, and B, that postmodernism was perceived as a capitalist and connected to the class of bourgeoisie, and therefore impossibly suitable for a classless society on its way to communism." The presentation at the same seminar of the Nikolai Quarter, by that time still under construction, was followed by a heated debate. Many people were agitated about the design of the facades with its arcades, bay windows, and decorations. However, during the discussion, also doubt was expressed. Who says that with these elements, with these aesthetic means, one cannot build socialist architecture? Where is that written? Alfred Hoffmann, who raised this question, was a social scientist and was the head organizer of the annual theory seminars. His question refers to a certain kind of written rule, as almost everything was regulated within guidelines and principles in the building sector. You might know of the 16 Principles of Urban Planning from the 1950s, for example. So in this context, the question wasn't odd in the first place. And actually, in 1982, new principles for architecture and urban design were given out that marked a turning point from housing developments in the outskirts of the cities towards inner city building, so a shift in the urban paradigm. Those principles stated, for example, one principle of socialist urban design is to design the city as a whole, culturally and economically. And our cities owe their beauty and their individual, varied image to the harmonious connection between new and old. In this way, historical cultural values will be preserved, while new and progressive structures and images of the city will be established, and better conditions for the development of the socialist way of life can be created. So there was a general idea for socialist architecture and planning, but no explicit stylistic guidelines. It was not clear what constituted socialist architecture, besides a not very concisely defined social content. The question, what it had to look like to make it socialist, has remained without a satisfactory answer until the end of the GDR. Another aspect stated in the guidelines was crucial too. One major challenge for today's generation of architects is to aesthetically master industrialized building with all its technological conditions. Whereas Friedrichstadt Palace and the Nikolai Quarter were rather extraordinary projects, the main building task was housing during the 1980s. Housing construction in the GDR meant, as in many socialist countries, building with prefabricated elements. However, East Germany was very rigid in the implementation of prefabrication and typification. There were only a handful of prefabrication series, and one prefabrication series dominated construction since the 1970s. Therefore, housing looked quite the same all over the Republic, with the residents living in the exact same floor plans from the Baltic Sea in the north down to the forests in the south. The 1980s, however, saw an adaptation of those series to the urban and architectural contexts. I brought some examples, like this one from Rostock, the so-called 5 Gable house, where the actual panels of the building construction are hidden behind these bricks, and there's lots of detailing. In Cottbus, you can find infills into the historic city, like those. In Halle, we've got also a broad variety of solutions for this inner city developments. And you can also go to Frankfurt on the Polish border. The adaptation worked mainly through the facades. Architects included references to local traditions or historic motifs, or to the immediate surroundings, and sometimes better, sometimes worse, and I'm not, also showing some of the catastrophes here. And they also used a stylistic vocabulary, squared windows, crossed balustrades, broken pediments, that can only be described as contemporary for the 1980s, if not as postmodern. However, the verdict of GDR theorists tended towards a different classification. Around the mid-1980s, theorists and historians came to a kind of consensus that GDR architecture wasn't postmodern, but neo-historical. Bruno Flier, maybe the most renowned architectural theorist, stated in a lecture on postmodernism that, in contrast, we in the GDR are building socially, therefore not postmodern, but concerning inner city housing, more and more adaptedly historicizing. And this adaptedly historicizing is a kind of direct translation, and often he uses neo-historical. In this sense, also the architectural historian and conservator Hermann Wirth was advocating for neo-historism. He said, "From the position of a solid, scientifically grounded historism, it should be possible to crusade against postmodernism." In a strange way, building neo-historical was still better than building postmodern, even if both were, in a narrow sense, not compatible with functionalist theory. The classification into a postmodern Western architecture and a neo-historical architecture in the East was done as a kind of socialist reinterpretation of the postmodern design approaches in the GDR, a rhetorical reinterpretation following the pattern, it looks postmodern, but it's not the same because we are creating architecture with a social content. So the distinction into form and content was stressed a lot during that time, and if one had to acknowledge that the architectural language had already changed in the 1980s, then it still seemed to be better to perceive it as neo-historism than as postmodernism. During the mid-1980s, the debate actually was not as heated anymore. Things were discussed quite objectively, and the word postmodernism was hardly used anymore in the discussion in the GDR, actually. The main focus lay on the current problems, how to deal with inner city building when obliged to use prefabricated building systems, how could those buildings be adapted to their historic surroundings, how to fight monotony and facilitate individuality, but not individualism. Actually, a main point of critique was the dictate of industrialized and especially typified building. The system of prefabrication was held onto, even though it was unsuitable for the contextualized and inner city developments. Architects who for once sought a chance to express themselves were limited to prefabrication systems, and it is no wonder that this resulted in a displeasure. And actually the absurdity that building decorated facades with industrialized means often was more expensive than traditionally built facades was not helping the case either. But in the end, it can be said that the build results were quite accepted and that a new approach to architecture and style was almost established. You can trace that within the introductory statements of Alfred Hoffmann on the seminars on architectural theory. That ranged from, today we are faced with various architectural handwritings, something that our society was demanding for many years in 1987, to him talking about the development of a new conception of architecture in 1988, always referring to GDR architecture. What this new conception could look like can be best illustrated with one of the, to me, most postmodern buildings of the GDR, the Bowling Center or Bowling Treff in Leipzig. Its construction started without the necessary permission from Berlin, which adds to the notion of dissidence, or at least protest, to its undeniably appealing design, and I let the images speak for themselves. Olaf Weber, architectural theorist from Weimar, called the Bowling Treff a quite interesting architecture where we learned a lot from these international experiences, referring to international postmodern architecture. As a last example, I want to refer to a talk that was given on the last seminar in 1989, with a slideshow of, as the presenter put it, the youngest results of architectural development in the GDR. So they were preparing for the 40-year anniversary and kind of already historicizing themselves. And in this presentation, he showed good examples of contemporary projects and contrasted them with bad examples of the years before, and especially of the 1970s. For instance, he pointed out the good urban quality of the Nikolai quarter, then already 2 years finished, and the very quarter that was controversially discussed in 1982. And he compared it to the lacking urban quality of Fischerinsel, an ensemble built in the 1970s, consisting of a group of high-rises, and actually in the direct neighborhood. This is Nikolai Quarter, and this is the 1970s development. In that sense, within only a few years, the atmosphere changed from strict refusal to an almost acceptance of postmodern approaches in urbanism and style. With my very brief summary of this discussion held at the seminars, I wanted to point out exactly this process. At first, the discussion was heated and very emotional, refusing postmodern styles and denying their existence in the GDR. Then the debate calmed down and became more objective, although avoiding the context of postmodernism as an international phenomenon. In the end, which means shortly before the end of the GDR in 1990, a new style in the GDR was established and from time to time even labeled as postmodern. In the meantime, theorists tried almost desperately to reframe or legitimate obvious formal similarities between the architecture in the East and in the West, and ended up with the distinction between form and content, and this social content as essential for socialist architecture. As other results, I'd like to stress that it's striking that the architects seem to be rather unimpressed by the theoretical debate and were not referencing it, or maybe not even following it. Starting with the awareness of a problem or even a crisis, we can trace a change in the approach towards architectural and urban design that is on the one hand a stylistic adoption from the West, but on the other hand an adaptation, interpretation and modification of postmodern design approaches to the context of building in a country with a highly standardized and typified building sector, with planned economy and with a permanent lack of building materials. Especially the residential buildings with adapted and modified prefabrication series may be a unique feature of GDR architecture that show a kind of everyday postmodernism, whereas there are only a few high postmodern buildings that can stand the comparison to buildings on an international level. The official debate, published, promoted, or encouraged by authorities and institutions, was based mainly on research on postmodern architecture in the West and only contrasting a different functionalist approach to architecture in the East. Research and its outcome that can be considered as an own genuine postmodern theory in the GDR wasn't published and was only spread orally, for instance at those seminars that were open only to a limited amount of participants. The rise of postmodernism came immediately before the fall of the wall in the GDR, and in this period of decline, postmodern design found loopholes in the otherwise regulated system, was even a means of dissidence, and a characteristic reaction to the symptoms of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Is there any question connected to the lecture? Okay.
Thank you very much for your lecture. What I want to ask, that in Hungary, house factories and state constructing companies leaded this whole process of prefab housing. So what about Eastern Germany? Who leaded the process? Architects or the factories or the companies?
Yeah, there was a whole system that was organized by the state on a state level with this institution, Bauakademie, as one institution that also was involved in the typification process and gave out those prefabrication series. And then there was a system on the level of the district. There were the construction companies actually that had their own design collectives and were again an adaptation also to the local context, to the local factories for the panels was implemented.
So maybe it can be said that the architects of the house factories or the design or the constructing companies, the own architects of these companies?
Yeah, in the end, the architects of the so-called combines, that most often combined designing and construction, were the ones that adapted the series to the construction site. But the general development of the typified series was on the state level in Bauakademie. But then there were a lot of regional kind of sub-series often. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks a lot for your presentation. I was wondering, I mean, you accurately pointed out that the East German government aligned itself with functionalism, and you also pointed out that some of the dissidents, like including Bruno Flierl and so on, were like steadfast promoters of functionalism and very hesitant to admit any, postmodern currents. So what is your interpretation then? How did postmodernism come about in East Germany? What motivated this strange move towards sponsoring something such as the Nikolai Viertel or these other things that you mentioned?
Yeah, to me now, after actually a longer period of research, I think that the decline of the system was played a major role in that, and that sometimes it was better for the state authorities to get give a bit leeway than to try to be this bottom, not top-down approach of functionalist theories and architecture.
So basically, an erosion of the system to a certain extent.
In a way, this is. I think there are many reasons. On the other hand, they could, with the Nikolai Quarter, it wasn't made for the GDR residents more than for the West, actually, and the competition between both German states played a role in accepting postmodern designs with this rhetorical reinterpretation, of course. And I think that architects had a bit more freedom, actually, in the very late years. And
would you say that Nikolai Viertel is absolutely untypical? It's something from it's a window for the West or something. It is shown as a decision from the uppermost, from Erich Honecker and so, have little Gable and so the the Ulbricht Berlin Mitte with its big highways and Fischerinsel we saw, but the social situation, this experiment to make these tribes with industrial building, prefabricated building parts referred to a social situation that there were lots of inner cities which were after 30 years of socialism, where the house owners had no money to repair them, and they were working together, and they had no materials to repair the roofs or something. And I remember how the touring cities looked like: Eisenach, Gotha, Erfurt. Erfurt, there were big old inner cities which were not destroyed in the war. Now we see what left in Erfurt was very beautiful. It was like a surprise. Oh, that was all in the streets where we could see that. And for instance, in Gotha, there was a wonderful Renaissance historic town, and the western part of the historic city was after 30 years of socialism was devastated, and it broke together. It was not, and it was destroyed. It was a field. It was absolutely brought away, and even with baroque buildings and so on. After that, there was a loss. They saw that they had these newly built areas outside, and then they had the inner cities which lost their face, and so they tried to find an emergency answer to this, and with the possibilities they had, and the alternative would have been to have everything, to have these cold, dead cities, and to lose everything, and they try to give them these cities a face, and but at least it didn't work. I remember even now we have in Gotha, the west, there's a wonderful now restored marketplace, and the eastern historic town in the west part is absolutely from these industrial parts of buildings with the old names of the streets and so, but it was much more, and everything was they made a free space from a big from half of the historic town, and then they had to build something there, and it couldn't look too brutal, and it's but it's something which was born from the emergency situation, and Nikolai Viertel is something else, something different, or something, I would say.
Yeah, well, in the inner cities, the city centers of the other towns that were not Berlin, the situation was it was worse, and they were neglected for a long time. And this turn to the city centers came at a point where the building sector was so focused on prefabricated and industrialized building that they were not only lacking the materials, but also the knowledge and the technicians that could actually handle renovations in this context. And I think it was a handful of reasons why the 1980s saw a lot of demolition of those actually preserved historic centers, and economic reasons, because they couldn't actually renovate it. Still the ideological reason that they wanted to show their progress and technological advancement, that they can build with these panel systems in the towns and still get a glimpse of the image of the city with these adaptations. But on the other hand, there was also a lot of protest and a lot of civic engagement against that. So it was I think also a point where the rigidness towards a functionalist design was torn down, because the people acknowledged, or the professionalists acknowledged the desire of the people for something to identify with. And Berlin was, with the Nikolai Quarter, a special case, because it was already were destroyed in World War II, and also the ruins were mostly torn down already in the 80s. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there? Yeah, there is.
Toward the end of your talk, you mentioned the dissidence of some of the architects or projects, and could you say a bit more about that? Because from what I understand from your argument, I got that during a very short time, like fewer than 10 years, from condemning postmodernism, the official discourse managed to adopt and to integrate postmodernism. So how does the notion of dissidence relate to that?
Yeah, the notion of dissidence mostly relates to a case that I didn't present here by two architects, that Bernd Ettel and Ensmann, that actually took part in competitions in the West with explicitly postmodern designs, and also in competitions in the East with the aim to provoke by design, and actually were imprisoned for that in the end. This is the short story. So this is the one point where it becomes very obvious that architecture could be a means of dissidence in that time. And the other was that there's a couple of examples where this postmodern designs, or this new architectural language, was kind of sneaked in. For example, with the bowling center in Leipzig, where the project was ongoing on the district level, and only at the point where it couldn't be stopped anymore without a major protest by the people who were actually building with the construction companies. Berlin had to say, yeah, okay, then make it so. And another aspect would be that the adoption from Western examples was so obvious. And it wasn't only through the designs, but also in a way of drawing. If you look at the student projects of the 1980s, then you can see that they also always use this lined isometries, and it looks like the drawings by Krier. And of course, they all had this kind of style from magazines like Bauwelt. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for this interesting lecture. I think we are moving forward to the next one.